Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are, or for that matter, I guess, when you are watching this. My name is Jay Shambaugh. I'm the co-director of the Institute for International Economic Policy here at GW. We at IIEP are really pleased to be hosting this event on Stephen Kaplan's new book as part of our virtual conference on China this year. Stephen is an IIEP affiliate and has been an active participant in the China conference over the years with us. And so we're really thrilled to be closing out our conference this year with Stephen's book. IIEP is located at the Elliott School at GW and is a cross-school interdisciplinary research center at GW. We aim to serve as a catalyst for high-quality, multidisciplinary, and nonpartisan research on policy issues surrounding economic globalization. That's a mandate we interpret pretty broadly. We do, support research and policy work in areas ranging from trade to international finance to development economics to poverty studies, climate change, and realistically economic policy more broadly. We've also, for quite a long time, had a very large focus on China's economic development and the US-China economic relationship. And this event falls squarely in that part of our mandate. We've been very busy at IIEP lately with ongoing series on India's economy, China's economy, inequality, rethinking capitalism, multidimensional poverty. Please visit our webpage if you'd like to see upcoming events, or for that matter, if you've missed any of the previous events in the series on China this year, you can find links to them on the website there as well. I want to give a special thanks to all the students who work at IIEP. They do pretty much all of the work behind the scenes, and it's a terrific team, and we couldn't pull off any of the things that we do without them. So thank you to our student staff, and also to Kyle Renner, our operations manager, who manages that very large team. At this point, I'd like to jump right in with the event itself and introduce Stephen Kaplan, who is a professor here at GW and an affiliate at IIEP, and he's got his new book coming out today. We're very excited to hear all about it. He's been working on it for quite a while, and we've heard bits and pieces over time, and so I really look forward to seeing kind of the whole thing pulled together. We're fortunate to have two fantastic discussants with us here today, who I'll introduce in more detail when they are about to speak. But Carol Weiss is a political scientist at USC, has written extensively on China and on Latin America and China in particular. She has a new book coming, or actually a book that is new, that is already out right now, called Dragonomics: How Latin America is Maximizing or Missing Out on China's International Development Strategy. And then she'll be followed by Professor Roselyn Hsueh from Temple, who has a new book also coming out soon on micro-institutional foundations of capitalism, looking at behavior of China, Russia, and India. So we've got a terrific team to talk about this topic today, and I am very excited to hear what all of them have to say. So with that, I will turn it over. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and the chat will be opened up at that point, and you can include questions in the chat, and I'll moderate the discussion there at the end. So without further ado, Stephen, let me turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. And thank you very much for attending this talk today. I also wanted to thank IIEP, including Jay Shambaugh, James Foster, Kyle Renner, and Maggie Chen, and IIEP staff and research assistants who've been helpful not only for this conference, but also on the research for this book as well. And I've always enjoyed attending this China conference, so this year is a pleasure to be able to present at the China conference. So we can begin by looking at the following graph, right? This graph basically shows international bank lenders over time. And you can see since the global financial crisis, China has increased its cross-border banking activity quite dramatically over the course of the last decade or so. Effectively, prior to the global financial crisis, you see that China basically was lending internationally comparatively to other rising powers, such as Brazil, And you can see now today, with the big increase in international lending over the course of the last decade and a half, we now see that China is one of the top 5 bank creditors internationally. So this basically poses the question, to what extent does China as a financier internationally act as other financiers, or to what extent is what China doing distinct and different from other creditors? So the book seeks to answer this question. And of course, right, I'm going to lay out an argument that does suggest that China is doing something distinct, and then examine what sort of China's approach to finance, the implications of that for a national economic policy making perspective. So we can see here, in terms of the broad theoretical framework, the departure point is the international political economy literature. For a long time, when assessing international financial activity internationally, right, there was the assumption that the capital that was moving around internationally was private, right? And because it was this private capital, and often short-term oriented towards bonds or equity markets, that oftentimes there was a threat of capital exit, right? And this threat of capital exit could create financial instability or even currency depreciation over time, hampering what governments could do from a policy autonomy perspective, what they could do with both monetary and fiscal policy. The argument I'm making that China's state-led approach to international financing has changed the basis of this theory, changed the basis of the trilemma, right? This capital exit threat is less likely to be as pronounced, giving countries more policy maneuverability, right? If we think of China's capital controls, they limit private investment, restrict ability of residents to invest in financial assets overseas, and as a result, there's minimal kind of short-term financial connections between China and the rest of the world. A lot of it ends up being longer term in terms of the financial connections. So let's look at this in a bit more detail now. Basically, within the book, I argue that there are 3 factors that make China's approach to capital and international banking different from other creditors, right? The first one reflects a long maturity structure, right? Effectively, China's loans can range anywhere from 17 to 20 years, compared to about 5 years for private creditors. They also tend to have an infrastructure focus. And probably most importantly, which makes China's financing unique, because obviously there are other long maturity lenders on a bilateral level and multilateral level, is that the scale of resources that China can commit to this kind of lending. So that's sort of one factor contributing to this patient capital, which is sort of what I dub sort of China's approach to international financing, that its capital is different and more patient. Also essential is higher risk tolerance, right? When we look at international crises and economic crises, quite often, given that private capital mobility, oftentimes during crises, we see capital exiting countries, right, historically. The argument that I make is that oftentimes China's policy bank investors are more risk tolerant, more likely to stay with their investment during good times and bad times. Why? Why would they do such a thing? Well, effectively, if we think of even as China enters into Latin America in the wake of the global financial crisis, right, they're able to basically gain market share over time by increasing these financial ties. How? What they do is they use the policy banks in order to gain cheap assets, market share, improve key logistical skills such as marketing, distribution, and local engineering capabilities, all to promote the internationalization of Chinese firms. So effectively, when we think of, even sort of multilateral loans, right, or market-based loans from the West, we often think of bankable projects, right? However, comparatively, in the book, I dub sort of what China does as maximizing markets rather than individual profitability. So they're trying to grow the market share of Chinese firms over time. So effectively, this strategy, particularly when you take in consideration that many of the policy banks are receiving implicit subsidies from the government, they can provide cheap financing in order to gain market share and cheap assets. Of course, it's not limitless. We've seen in places like Venezuela and Pakistan that there are limits in terms of what China is willing to do, but nonetheless, they have much more risk tolerance historically than what we've seen elsewhere. You could see an example of this if we look at China's FDI into Brazil. We see the global financial crisis, right? Chinese FDI coming into Brazil, taking advantage of that crisis dip. Similar, we see the 2014 commodity downturn and Rousseff's impeachment and the Lava Jato scandal, car wash scandal as well, all opportunities for Chinese FDI to come into Brazil and gain cheap assets and market share, right? Where comparatively, quite oftentimes during crises, we've seen sudden stops where Western capital actually leaves during these crisis moments. Now, the third factor that I argue that makes China's approach to international finance distinct is its non-conditional lending. But when I say non-conditional, I specifically mean, right, lack of policy conditionality, right? So what I'm thinking about is sort of Western finance, right? Typically through multilateral institutions and even sort of, market, perceptions, et cetera. There's a focus on policy conditions. What is the country doing in terms of its fiscal policy and monetary policy? What are its key structural forms, ranging from privatization to deregulation? And what is the progress being made? And oftentimes this is linked, right, to either multilateral loans or even kind of market assessment of how a country is doing. Comparatively, right, dating back to sort of developing country norm development, in the 1950s at conferences like the Badong Conference, China has a commitment to non-intervention in domestic affairs through its 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So rather than having policy conditionality, they sort of pledge, okay, sovereignty first, we're going to leave. We may have our policy banks giving advice to countries like Venezuela, but Venezuela doesn't need to adhere to that advice necessarily to continue to get loans. However, it doesn't mean that China doesn't have conditionality, right? They still have what I call commercial conditionality, where financing is instead secured through loans that are collateralized by future commodity deliveries, guaranteed contracts with Chinese firms or suppliers, or commitment to buy Chinese machinery. We're going to go into these sort of commercial conditions in more detail in just a bit. But the important thing is to understand that there's a trade-off, right? So countries to some extent may get more macroeconomic flexibility when going to China, but there's going to be more commercial conditions or microeconomic conditionality instead. So we'll return to that in a few moments. What I want to show you now is how Chinese policy bank loans have grown in the Americas as a share of GDP. You can see prior to the global financial crisis, policy banks were not doing that much within Latin America. However, you can see the growth beginning in 2008 with the global financial crisis. And compared to other types of lending that sovereign governments do today, such as bonds or multilateral loans, you could see that China's share of GDP in terms of these policy bank loans has grown rather quickly to now account for the same amount as multilateral loans in terms of a share of GDP. So I've made the argument that China's patient capital, right, that features essentially long-term, risk-tolerant, non-conditional financing is different from these traditional Western market financing forces. The question is, what are the implications then? So we're first going to look at these implications in terms of macro policy, and then we'll look at them in terms of microeconomic policy. But first of all, I want to look at one other element before we move forward, and that's the investment channel, right? So in the press, quite often we hear of China's state-led capitalism, China's state-to-state loans or cooperation loans. And in Latin America, this is a big part of the game, right? I mean, China used these policy bank loans in a way to kind of catalyze, as mentioned before, markets abroad, particularly in infrastructure and energy sectors. But it's not all that they've been doing. They also use these policy banks in sort of markets as well, right? When governments have public procurement, rather than necessarily allocating these loans directly to governments, with governments being the intermediary, we see when there's public procurement, these loans are instead allocated directly towards the corporate enterprises as part of the project bid, as part of the project financing. And so in this case, what I argue is, depending upon that channel of the loan, state versus market, the implications for macroeconomic policy and governments will be much different. You can see in Latin America, quite a lot of these loans end up being state to state, but historically there's also been market-oriented loans. And in fact, even sort of a commitment moving forward to use these market-oriented loans even more than the state-to-state loans, given some of the difficulties that China's had with state-to-state loans in certain countries such as Venezuela, as we'll talk about in a little bit. So effectively, I want to now talk about, with these two channels, we have the state-to-state channel and the private procurement channel. I want to highlight two quick examples of a project so you can kind of more specifically understand what I'm talking about in terms of the channel. We have the hydropower stations in Santa Cruz, Argentina. We also have sort of the solar park in Argentina, the Cachari Solar Park. The solar park goes through a private procurement channel. The hydropower stations go through a state-to-state channel. So in project terms, the state-to-state channel is direct contracting with Chinese banks if it's concessional, right? So in Argentina, essentially, if you get good interest rates, you could directly contract with Chinese banks, right? And in terms of the way the contract is then stipulated, about a quarter of that went to loans to pay for Chinese machinery and equipment, such as turbines. But about 3/4 of that loan actually went to fungible civil works projects, right? And this is what gives governments that spending discretion. So what we see with a state-to-state loan and direct contracting is more spending discretion. Now, at the cost, to some extent, of the spending discretion is transparency. For example, with these hydroelectric projects in Argentina, there was a lot of concern about environmental sustainability, right? There was a national landmark called Perito Moreno Glacier. And there's a lot of concern that this hydroelectric plant would have negative repercussions for that glacier. There was also concern about the quality of the water and pollution as well, but the terms of the deal, the fine print, weren't broadly known. So this project eventually even gets a legal stay through the Supreme Court in Argentina because of these concerns. We see a renegotiation eventually reducing the number of turbines and generating capacity to make it more environmentally friendly, right? But we see the trade-off in terms of greater government discretion, policy autonomy versus less transparency, and then potential costs in terms of environmental sustainability because of that lack of transparency. Comparatively, let's look at the private procurement channel. There we have a privately managed auction system called Renovar. And we see that Shanghai Electric Power Construction wins the bid, right, for $300 million. But the loan flows directly to the project level, directly the corporate enterprises winning the bid rather than the Argentine government. You don't get the same spending discretion. We have sort of China Exim Bank entering the picture, but we get tied aid, right, in terms of having to buy some Chinese machinery and equipment, but we don't get sort of the kind of commercial conditionality that we'll talk about in a minute that's more oriented towards hedging Chinese risk, right, in terms of commodity guarantees and things along these lines. Now, in terms of transparency, however, we see when it flows to this private channel, transparency was better, right? It compelled local community consent. The community received training to work in the plant, construction and operations. They even participated in the profits, right? So here we get, with a private procurement channel, less government discretion, less policy flexibility, but more transparency, right? And so these are some of the trade-offs and why, if Chinese financing flows to the state and the state is an intermediary versus it flowing to the private sector, why there could be a difference. So first of all, what I want to look at now is look at sort of the repercussions here in terms of macro policy, in terms of policy autonomy, and then we'll look at sort of the trade-off between policy conditionality and commercial conditionality, right? So even if countries get more degrees of maneuverability with Chinese financing, the costs are greater commercial conditions. But let's first look at policy conditionality. Here you see just some stylized facts. As China's patient capital increases, it's in the blue, right? You see over time, as it increases, primary budget balance, primary deficits grow over time. So there does seem to be this relationship between higher Chinese public financing, state-to-state financing, and greater budget deficits. Let's look at this in a few other ways. You can see in terms of the regression coefficients here as well, whether normalized by external debt or whether normalized by GDP, we get the same pattern. China's state-to-state financing increases, and the negative represents government deficits increasing at the same time, meaning governments appear to be able to have greater fiscal deficits when they use Chinese financing. Look at some of the other instruments, other types of financing we mentioned before. When governments instead borrow from bond markets, whether normalized by debt or GDP, you have a positive coefficient, right? Meaning narrowing of budget deficits or austerity is more likely. Similarly, with multilateral loans, you have a positive coefficient, meaning when you have multilateral loans, budget deficits tend to narrow. There tends to be more austerity. So we see that variation based upon China's financing instruments versus traditional instruments from multilaterals or markets, that there does seem to be a different pattern here in terms of budget flexibility. You can see it here across models once again, right? Sustained, statistically significant, negative, coefficients highlighting that correlation between growing budget deficits and higher Chinese financing. We can also see it with this graph showing Argentina, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Venezuela from 2000 to 2018, right? Many of these governments during this time had leftist governments, right? Even with leftist partisans, however, you can see throughout the 2000s, we had budgetary surpluses, right? Because they were getting their financing from markets and multilaterals that emphasized budget discipline, that had policy conditionality targets for fiscal performance. Comparatively, look once China enters the picture during the 2008 financial crisis. They're in blue once again. You can see as China's policy bank loans expand, we can see that budget deficits turn negative. Now, not surprisingly, during a crisis, it makes sense that governments, right, would try to have a counter-cyclical response. In general, Latin America did a good job during the global financial crisis of having a counter-cyclical response. But you can see that typically Keynesian economic policies would suggest once you have an upturn, right, you should get some narrowing of those budget deficits again. You don't get that, right? You just get sustained budget deficits over time in these countries, in part because I argue China doesn't have that scrutiny that Western multilaterals and markets do. Let's look at the null case, right? Brazil is a case. I mentioned the importance of investment channel before. Brazil is a case where rather than having state-to-state financing, it does a lot of financing with China, but it all goes through public procurement, all goes to corporate enterprises through the market. Comparatively, you see in 2014 and into that election, we do get a growing fiscal deficit in Brazil, right, where Rousseff was trying to kind of prime the pump for re-election. And even, right, there were some, concerns about, transparency in the budget. Rousseff came under scrutiny about that later. So you do see, as a result, right, fiscal deficits do grow in Brazil. But what is the crisis reaction? Brazil is mainly relying upon Western financing in terms of Brazil, the government, rather than private entities. And so Brazil, right, has a lot of pressure to maintain that budget discipline. So we actually see, even amid crisis, Brazil passes a constitutional spending cap that limits its expenditures in order to have budget discipline and encourage capital from private finance to come back into the country in order to help spur growth. So compared to that policy conditionality, right? So we just saw that effectively when countries borrow from China directly, when their governments borrow from China directly, they tend to get more room to maneuver. They tend to have larger fiscal deficits. Now, of course, I highlighted earlier that even with greater flexibility and policy conditionality, there's a cost, right? Any credit internationally has costs and benefits. With China, the cost is more micro rather than macroeconomic. So we get commercial conditionality. And what I argue is that commercial conditionality can take two forms, right? One, it can be used to promote Chinese commerce. Two, it can be used to manage sovereign risk. So when commercial conditionality takes the form of promoting Chinese commerce, it can look a lot like Tide aid historically, right? Where essentially in exchange for borrowing money from China and loans from China, you have to contract with Chinese firms or buy Chinese machinery, right? So effectively, with these kind of conditions, it becomes a trade deal to some extent, right? Negotiating over local content, with China trying to maximize its foreign content and the recipient country trying to maximize its local content, right? Take Argentina, for example. When you have the construction of the cargo railway, Argentina doesn't make locomotives. So fine, right? For those loans, if China wants to bring in locomotives, right? And Argentina imports locomotives, no problem. However, there is an industry for the local railway ties. So you see Argentina negotiating to try to protect that local content, right? So you have these tools for commercial conditionality that promote essentially a trade negotiation about content. You also often have commercial interest rates that could be below market, as was the case in Venezuela, in order for China to try to secure more market share in Venezuela energy and oil markets. Comparatively, it also may be sometimes if China's worried about sovereign risk, it could have higher interest rates, as was the case in Ecuador, right? In Ecuador, Chinese financing became very polemic in part because of the high interest rates that were charged, right? Where even some government officials resigned over the high rate of capital. Now, comparatively, we also have tools for managing sovereign risk. Interest rates can be used in that way, as just highlighted. But in addition, right, we have administrative channels, with China putting a lot of emphasis on its state-to-state ties to resolve conflict, right? So when I mentioned before, Argentina was constructing those hydroelectric plants, the Macri, right, government, before it came into office in the 2015 campaign, was essentially highlighting its concerns about the lack of the fine print, the lack of transparency in these deals, and was pushing sort of concerns about environmental sustainability of the hydroelectric plants. Macri government comes to office, it basically has a legal stay under the Supreme Court to halt construction. China's very concerned. How does China deal with it? State to state. They write letters, right? They engage in diplomacy, and they highlight cross default clauses in the contract saying, well, listen, you know, if you actually decide not to move forward with a hydroelectric plant in the South, we have cross default clauses that protect Chinese interests elsewhere in the country, and we will halt Chinese financing from those other projects, such as the Belgrano cargo railway, that you consider to be very developmentally important, right? So we see state-to-state relations, cross-default clauses as ways of protecting Chinese interests internationally. We also see commodity guarantees and commodity-backed loans, meaning the government will provide a state guarantee, right, to the loan it gets from China, pledging it will repay the loan, and will back it with resources or land. Comparatively, it will also, quite often in Latin America, we've seen commodity-backed loans, meaning there's two separate contracts. There's a debt contract, right, where you have the loan extended to governments like Ecuador and Venezuela, but simultaneously, there's a commercial contract in the natural resource sector. State-owned enterprises from an Ecuador or Venezuela will have a contract to ship oil out to China's enterprises. With the proceeds of that oil, they'll put it in a special account that is dedicated to repaying the debt. So that's another key way, even without policy conditionality, that China uses commercial conditionality to hedge this risk. So now let's look at commercial conditionality in more detail. Very quickly, this is an example of the language of the cross-default clause. This contract is for the hydroelectric plants in the South. And you can see that in the event of default under the Belgrano facility agreement, right, this financing would get pulled as well. Very interestingly, in the Argentina deal, China was actually really concerned about the Belgrano railway not moving forward, not the hydroelectric plant. The reason being, it provided a lot more than usual financing to the hydroelectric plants in the South. And it also featured, right, less Chinese content than normal. So comparatively, it was really important for China to ensure that the Belgrano Railway moved forward because there was more local content for China, right, and less financing. So from China's perspective, it was a better deal. So the cross default clause that becomes sort of a key part of negotiations on a state-to-state level between Argentina and China, rather than being oriented towards protecting the hydroelectric plant, was actually oriented towards protecting the investment in Belgrano Railway. But this is very common in terms of China's commercial contracts as a way to mitigate that financial risk, right? If you don't go forward with one project commercially, we'll pull funding from another, right? So you see these cross linkages, also highlighting the importance of market maximization in China, right? They're not trying to just get one profitable project. They're trying to spur, right, markets abroad, right? Investment abroad, trade abroad. Okay, so let's look at this in a bit more detail. When we look at commercial conditionality, if we look back here, I said there were two kinds of commercial conditions. One, to promote Chinese commerce, tide aid, we'll call that one. And then two, managing sovereign risk. As you can see here, when you have a state-to-state relationship between, or state-to-state financing between China and its debtors, right? That's in gray, the state-to-state, we get a lot more of number two, right? Kind of commercial conditions oriented towards mitigating financial risk, right? So essentially the argument is if it's going through the corporate sector, yeah, you'll get sort of with these loans, some Chinese content, but you won't get the kind of commercial conditionalities that are oriented towards mitigating risk, right? That happens more on a state-to-state level, where without policy conditionality, China has to hedge its risk somehow, right? So they do it to some extent legally, right? Or they do it with commodities and land the same way they did it with their domestic model through its own development years. We can also see this in the following chart, right? That effectively China hedges its state-to-state risk with commercial conditionality. The more state-to-state financing we see over time, the greater amount of these commercial conditions we tend to see that are mitigated, that are oriented towards mitigating financial risk. Okay, so now I want to take a moment to kind of discuss the cost and benefits, right? The way the book is structured, the first half is all about China as a creditor and its approach to financing, this patient capital approach. The second half of the book looks at Latin America and sort of the cost and benefits for Latin America as a debtor, right? Compared to other kinds of financing historically. What are the benefits? Well, China's commitment to long-term financing aligns really well with Latin America and other developing countries, right? Development horizon, right? If you take Latin America during the 90s and 2000s, right? They had to follow through with a lot of austerity in order to attract foreign direct investment, in order to get new loans, right? They had to have fairly good budget discipline. And we did see throughout the 90s, right? Budgetary surpluses increasing or budget deficits narrowing. But how do you do that, right? Lots of times Latin America didn't necessarily want to cut social spending, right? Education, healthcare, these kind of things. They cut infrastructure. So the era of austerity in the 90s and 2000s was an era of cutting infrastructure projects. So Latin America's investment in the 2000s in infrastructure was about 0.6% of GDP compared to 3% rates in 1980s. So we see, right, from a development standpoint, the region's very excited to get Chinese capital coming in and to provide this long-term capital and financing, particularly the extent to which they even get policy flexibility as well. However, there are costs, as we've highlighted. The costs are the commercial conditions that are tied to Chinese firms, products, and machineries. As mentioned before, essentially what ends up happening is you get a trade microeconomic negotiation over local content. Countries that have better negotiating capacity, larger markets, are better able to carve out local opportunities, right? Comparatively, right, there can then be concerns about a middle income trap for Latin America, right? Industrial upgrading is a key feature of China's sort of cooperation plans, its Latin America development plan, but only 1/10 of Chinese FDI has been destined for the Latin American manufacturing sector. 2/3 of that has gone to a really large market in Brazil. So there's a question, even though sort of a key agenda item for Latin America is upgrading, a key goal of Latin America, given its historic struggles with commodity dependency, has been to diversify into the industrial sector, right? But to what extent can China deliver those industrial opportunities, those manufacturing opportunities? We see them in a place like Brazil with large market share. We see auto manufacturing kind of investment there. But Latin America has far higher labor costs than Africa or Southeast Asia. So to what extent, if China's coming in and trying to invest in infrastructure and energy and extractive sectors, and then, right, we get Latin America importing a lot of machinery and capital as a result, to what extent does that intensify commodity dependency? To what extent does that intensify industrial stagnation, creating a middle income trap? And then the final item is indebtedness, right? And importantly, when we talk about indebtedness, we need to be careful, right? We have sort of memes out here in the DC policy space about debt trap diplomacy. I make an argument that rather than a debt trap, right? Debt trap diplomacy suggests that China intentionally, right, gives cheap financing to countries, increases their indebtedness in order to acquire assets internationally. I don't think that's how sort of the channel, the micro foundations quite work there, right? I think comparatively what happened in places like Venezuela is a creditor trap. China's increasing its learning curve in terms of being an international financier and misprices risk occasionally, right? And I think what's happened is we've seen countries increase their indebtedness is China has made a bet, right? They've made a bet that they could, rather than have policy conditionality, rather than approach sovereign risk the same way as the West, they could mitigate that risk with commodities. And I think in places like Venezuela, they found out, right, that if there's a commodity downturn, if there's problems in oil production, right, as Venezuela's had, it can be very difficult to recover those payments, even when it's collateralized or securitized by oil proceeds and oil payment. So we'll look at this in just a moment in a bit more detail, but I do highlight that rather than a debt trap, we really get a creditor trap quite often with China in a place like Latin America. Let's look at these charts just for a moment, though. With about 5 minutes remaining here. Effectively, this looks at Latin America's high-tech manufacturing imports over time. And you can see the concern about a middle income trap here, where China joins the WTO in 2002. You have the global financial crisis in 2008, but kind of throughout that period of time, high-tech manufacturing imports from China just increased in the region. So in places like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, to what extent, right, does that affect industrial competitiveness, manufacturing competitiveness in those areas, right? Here, comparatively, you see high-tech manufacturing imports from US over time, not necessarily near sort of the amount or the degree of increase we see from China. So there are concerns about intensifying the middle income trap. There's also concerns about reinforcing commodity dependency, right? Here again, from 2002, when China joins the WTO, we see primary commodity exports to China already high and increasing, though steadily over time. And then comparatively, we see manufacturing good exports to China decreasing incrementally, right, over time as well. So there's a question of, okay, are you reinforcing Latin America dependency with sort of these commercial contracts and commercial conditions? So the final cost then is indebtedness, right? And here Venezuela provides a really nice example. I'll show you some graphs in a moment. But effectively, you have China that initially, from a commercial standpoint, with its internationalization, its go global strategy, looks at Venezuela and says, wow, we could create an energy presence, right? A presence in the oil sector by gaining our market share in Venezuela. They do these state-to-state cooperation deals, extend loans to Venezuela in order to promote, right, its firms internationally, in order to promote, right, its energy presence in Latin America and Venezuela. Now, they had sought to securitize these loans with oil for loan deals, right? So essentially, they would get loans. They would, again, sell commodities through their state-owned enterprises to China, and with the proceeds, put them in a special account that's dedicated to repaying that debt. So effectively, that was the hedge. What ends up happening, of course, is as commodity prices start to fall, right? And along with that, we have lots of governance problems within Venezuela. Remember, there's not policy conditionality. So China's policy banks may say, hey, Venezuela, please balance your budget, or maybe you need to realign your currency, or maybe they have different recommendations along those lines, Venezuela is not compelled to do it, right? So the extent to which you got economic mismanagement, a fall in commodity prices, a lack of reinvestment in state-owned oil companies, oil production falls over time. Hence, the ability, right, of China to recover its investment gets more and more difficult. So they end up similar to US banks in the 1980s. They end up defensively lending, extending and rolling over credit lines in order to get their money back, their interest and principal. They get their money back by trying to help produce oil locally within Venezuela, because those oil proceeds are key to getting their investment back. Let's look at this in a little more detail. You can see Venezuela here, and this is a composition of Venezuela's foreign debt. Importantly, remember, I mentioned before that this is much more a creditor trap for China than necessarily a debt trap, right? That China unleashes on the world. You can see here, China in red counts for about 20% of Venezuela's overall foreign debt, right? Comparatively, you have a lot of other creditors that are rolling over funds during Venezuela's difficult times, right? You have Wall Street, commercial banks, many other, right, countries, and many other specifically private sector actors that are accounting for this indebtedness. Also, once 2014 hits, once you even before that have a transition from Chavez, right, though an ideologue, also able to be pragmatic and follow a depreciation, right, or more pragmatic, disciplined policies if necessary, Maduro proved to be more pure ideologue, not willing to kind of manage the economy in the same way Chavez was. China starts disinvesting even at that point. So it had a huge amount of investments flowing into Venezuela, but we actually see it starting to deleverage or unwind those investments beginning in 2013, 2014, which also goes against that debt trap narrative, right? You see China, once it has a high degree of credit risk, trying to unwind that exposure, not trying to purposely get Venezuela more indebted. Finally, we also see here the point about securitizing your investment with oil revenues, right? These are this is oil production in Venezuela, thousands of barrels per day. You can see that effectively Venezuela's oil production collapses, right, amid its humanitarian and economic crisis, right? And so what ends up happening is you have about 15, by the time you get to 2020, you have 15% of the output in the oil sector that you had in 2013. China securitized its investments through these oil for loan deals. So as sort of oil production collapses, China has to move into this defensive lending posture, right, in order to protect its investments. In the red, you can see is China here, right, the pre-committed oil shipments to China. The yellow is Russia. The blue is the rest of the cash that the company has to reinvest in its state-owned enterprises. You can see that cash crunch happening over time, and hence why China's bet went awry, right? Why they mispriced risk. They couldn't get the oil, right, shipped so that they could get the proceeds to Venezuela so that they can repay their debt, right? And so China gets in a trap from a credit perspective, very similarly to other creditors historically as well. So what is the repercussions of this, right? So just talk about these repercussions and then we'll close the talk here. Effectively, what we see China doing, given that places like Ecuador, Venezuela, Argentina, right, they've had to engage in some elements of project restructuring or debt restructuring, they've started to, since the 2014 commodity downturn, diversify their investments away from the state-to-state channel and moving instead towards the market channel, more private procurement, more equity financing, meaning they get a long-term acquisition, right, at the beginning of a project of a piece of company rather than large state-to-state debt deals, right? This is a way to diversify their exposure. They've committed since 2014 $40 billion in Latin American funds, but importantly, this is an incremental slow strategy. State-to-state financing, particularly in terms of debt outstanding, still represents about 90% of overall debt outstanding, right, within China. And these funds they started to use but only 2 billion, right, of these state-backed equity funds have been allocated into Latin America for about 5% of the total amount for these funds. So the extent to which they're trying to diversify into equity, away from debt, they've created instruments to do this, but it's been an incremental, slow process. They've also moved towards multilateralism. If you look at President Xi's 2017 versus 2019 speech at the BRI Forum, you get a lot more emphasis on multilateralism, investment partners, using multilateral institutions for partnerships ranging from the World Bank to Inter-American Development Bank, and using AIB as well as kind of a key feature of this multilateral financing overture as a way, to some extent, to start to also diversify away from some of these investments that have gone awry on a state-to-state level. I will underscore that since China has a project commercial focus, there's been successes, right? If you look at that cargo railway in Argentina, a country where that cargo railway can cover about 70% of the country, there are some real development advantages of investing in that cargo railway, right? So not every investment has gone bust, but sort of in their portfolio, some countries, China has encountered more headwinds than others and has been forced to restructure in places like Venezuela and Ecuador. And when they've had to be sort of restructuring, right, just like the banks in the 1980s, China's been forced into this defensive lending position because of its exposure to the region being so high through its policy banks. As the old saying holds from Keynes, owe your banker 1,000 pounds and you're at his mercy, owe him 1 million pounds and the position is reversed. We see China has learned as a creditor to some extent, and as a result has tried to mitigate the state-to-state lending, and it's had to do it through a defensive lending posture. So thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions. And back over to Jay.
Thanks so much. That was a terrific tour of a book. It's pretty hard to do an entire book in a presentation, and that was really, really terrific. I enjoyed hearing all about it. And so I want to turn it straight over to Carol Wise for her comments. And just to let people know in the audience, after the discussion and Stephen's response, we'll have probably 15-20 minutes for Q&A, and the chat should be coming up relatively soon, and you can put questions in the chat and I'll bring them over to the group. Carol, to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be here, Stephen. Congratulations on the book. It is a tour de force. I've been telling you this for 3 years. The final product is even more of a tour than I had expected. I've got my own timer set here because I was instructed yesterday with a little warm up that it's 10 minutes. And so let me start with the contribution. It's a huge contribution. Especially all the mishigas in the press and, the kind of, confusion over the nature of Chinese state financing and these lending, the massive lending that's been going on across the emerging economies. Just lots of misreporting, misunderstanding and whatnot. And you really break it down. I'm going to speak mainly from the Latin American standpoint. Rosie's the expert on China. Certainly capitalism in China. So let me just say that, let me just start with some basics because your presentation was fabulous, but it's very technical. And let's do some kind of IPE big picture things here. I think what has not been clear all along, especially as we heated up in the last 4 years, right, with the US administration, I don't want to say the name, but the US administration being so hostile toward China, right? Debt trap, predator, and all of that. China is a phenomenon we have never seen, which is an emerging economy that is capital abundant. We have never seen this level of capital abundance in an emerging economy, and they've got to disperse those funds. The other thing that I think is really important is, and I think you go home to this several points in the book, but they have basically, you call it externalized their domestic development strategy. I call it internationalizing the domestic development strategy. And what's so offensive to especially, the West, led by the US opinion here, negative opinion toward China, what's so offensive is that they don't understand it. Well, they don't like it and they don't understand it. But basically, one thing I think that is really good, I mean, I will use this book for my undergraduate IPE course in the fall, and I'm going to have to be breaking a lot of things down. But one is how China's outward strategy with lending and investment in infrastructure is an extension of what was it? Crossing the river with the stones or whatever, an extension of this trial by trial experimental learning that others have written very well about. And you actually have the data, you've broken it down. This is a masterful database. I mean, you could milk this, for the rest of your career, right? The other thing is just the diversity of China's policy bank lending. I mean, I know some of the details, I've written about it, but I mean, this is really like black and white, hardcore, public procurement versus state to state. Also, it's like, I think, even the Financial Times, it's like, well, why is China lending Venezuela more money to pay back more money that they've lent? And it's a defensive strategy, as you say. I don't think it's working. I think that Venezuela, secondarily Ecuador, does have China in a debt trap, but these aren't the only ones. I'd say a creditor trap. These aren't the only ones. And you have set us up here to really see the inside story, because these haven't even exploded. I mean, right before the holidays, right? I mean, the Chinese are having to finally write off bankrupt state-owned enterprises domestically, and they are halting lending and whatnot, or putting a lid on it for a while. So all of this starts coming in to focus with your analysis. There's a huge difference between the public procurement and the state to state, and I completely agree with you that moving toward public procurement, it's one of the next phases of Chinese, learning by doing, experimentation with this. But I think it's a direction that they have to go. You know what? Where's my time? My phone just went poop on me, Jay. Okay, so let me bring up a few.
You're still good. You've got a few minutes left.
Okay, so just a few. All right, now now we're going to turn over to things that I'm going to just kind of push you on. So this is straight from Kaplan and Penfold. I believe it's 219, which is the Venezuelan high-speed railway. It says in the end, it collapsed, right? The project, and factories along the construction corridor were ransacked for their computers, technology, copper wiring, power generators, and metal sidings. So that is something that you kind of gracefully don't bring up with regard to some of the real downside of these things. Now, let's go to these are technical things, and I'm not going to dwell on them too much. When we reviewed this with Barbara Stallings and Miles Kaler, I think 3 years ago, we did question the extent to which what you're describing with China's outward capital flows, debt, lending, and whatnot in the developing countries, but also Latin America, Mandel's impossible trinity, right? Can you have capital mobility, fixed exchange rate, and monetary autonomy? I don't think your situation, I still don't think that your situation or what you've described with regard to China has cracked that code. And I think that certainly with the end of fixed exchange rates, or really tightly tied ones, the bottom line is monetary autonomy and managing capital flows. Okay, so let me see here. I'm questioning the amount of policy maneuverability, even though a lot of these funds on the state-to-state side are fungible. For example, the Argentines are constantly complaining that there's really nothing left over from this investment in these hydroelectric plants. They had expected to have a little more fungibility, i.e. for corruption, quite frankly. So I don't know how much maneuverability there really is on the macro side. your book's coming out. I mean, it's at a perfect point because we're not out of the pandemic in the region. And so you've set us up, I think, for a really good analysis of before the pandemic and China, Latin America financial relations afterwards, because it's going to be, I think, something completely different. Anybody looking at the Venezuela situation would say, the Chinese should just forget about that money. They're not going to see it anyway, but they don't want to do that. They won't be a lender of last resort. They've made that very clear. And so where they're going to go and one of the things, how China is going to resolve this creditor trap thing is not just for Latin America. It is going to be a big insight and I think very instructive for the rest of the financial market, apart from China. Okay, I don't understand why these state-backed equity funds, the China Latin America Cooperation Fund, I don't understand why it is so hard to spend that money. Mexico has a fund with China. I forget what the amount is. They haven't spent any of it, right? And I really am not clear on that. Okay, I think my time truly is up. There's so much more I want to say. It's a really, it's a contribution. This is iconic. It is a big work. It really is. Then I'm going to leave to you to tell us a little more about, quote, Xi's rightful conception of kindness profits. If you could tell us that's one of my favorite phrases in the book. Stephen, it was really a pleasure, and it's a pleasure to be here and to congratulate you. It's a major work.
Thank you very much. Jay, do I respond to each discussant in sequence or both at once?
You're muted, Jay.
Yeah, sorry, I was being blocked from unmuting. So sorry. Yes, I'd like to, why don't we let Roselyn go next, and then Stephen, you can kind of respond to both. So Roselyn, please take it away.
And I will Carol Wise as well. It's just the excellence of this book. It's ambitious in scope and frankly satisfying in substance. So Stephen, many congratulations for this prestigiously researched and elegantly argued monograph. So please allow me to just highlight what I find most invigorating and inspirational about banking unconditionality. And I will also, of course, engage its arguments and findings with my own work and existing work that's out there. So in terms of, what I find most invigorating and inspirational, banking unconditionality shows how and explains why Chinese global lending is Janus-based for those countries that receive it. Patterns of Chinese patient capital and long-term finance promote trade and globalization, potentially long-term sustainable growth and decreasing social economic inequalities. At the same time, it can also perpetuate dependency, political patronage, corruption, rent-seeking behavior, growing debt burden. And of course, it also has effects on China as well. We have, on the one hand, Chinese capital eliminating the Mandela trilemma, as Stephen has already mentioned. And then also on the other hand, the behavior and impacts of Chinese capital being greatly influenced also by local institutional conditions, right? He highlights specifically differences in types of finance channels. Another reason I really like this book is that it is substantiated by adept triangulation of multiple data sources and data gathering methods in its contribution of primary data. Carol mentioned it's just this trove of primary data. I'm just incredibly impressed by the interviews that Stephen conducted with government and market stakeholders in China and Latin American countries. And essentially you leverage your Latin American studies knowledge and expertise and cross-checking it with Chinese global and national level data. You track down and you confirm actual capital disbursements, not just commitments. And what I find interesting is that the book shows that outstanding loans to Latin America to be half of those apparently calculated by existing data sets. So that's I also further appreciate the longitudinal view that the study provides, right? As Carol mentioned too, tracing the impacts of Chinese finance through the 2008 financial crisis, through the 2014 downturn in global commodity booms, and then in addition to all the twists and turns of national politics. And now, obviously, during the pandemic and post-pandemic, there just be so much more to apply some of the arguments of the book to this next critical juncture. I do have a few thoughts about how the book characterizes Chinese investment, and then also the nature and origins of the Chinese approach. So in here, the book argues that Chinese patient capital reflects China's financial regulatory environment. China invests in long-term commercial opportunities as opposed to short-term ones due to capital control restrictions and so forth, endures greater risk tolerance, and does not require policy conditionalities, and focusing particularly on commercial conditionalities, which I believe one of the Q&A questions mentioned, and I also a question as well, is what if some of these commercial conditionalities are in fact or could be transformed or into policy conditionalities, but just policy conditionalities redefined, right? Policy conditionalities in China's perspective, but perhaps not necessarily tied to neoliberal policy conditionalities, but other types. But first I wanted to mention that the book roots in chapter 2, China's global policy, in how China imitates Japanese FDI operating in China, and contends that that's how they had saw Japanese FDI funding China's domestic development. In fact, it is a little bit more complicated or complex than that. The state goals and methods associated with China's globalization, including the embrace of foreign direct investment, only to re-regulate internally, and the use of state-owned policy banks in loans, aid, and outbound OFDI, in fact, remarkably, I've shown in my research, departs from Japanese developmental state and the Japanese approach. I do appreciate the discussion of geostrategic, geoeconomics, and domestic development goals of the Chinese government in its lending through the Chinese XM and Chinese development banks. And so I do appreciate that discussion of the multidimensionality of China's motives. I wanted to see, or I had some questions about the impacts of that multidimensionality of strategic motivations, as well as potentially competing interests even within Chinese capital. So one couple questions I had was, is Chinese state capital monolithic in actors and methods? Are there ways to both acknowledge that it is Chinese state capital, but also then still disaggregate to better understand its motives and effects? Why is it that China can afford patience? Is it simply just cheap seats and long-run business opportunities through commercial conditionalities? Is Chinese capital always patient? And for those who know my work, I'm going to ask the question: are there sectoral level economic and political motivations driving some of these loan details and project level bargains? So, for example, in the commercial conditionalities to maximize Chinese foreign content, commodity guarantees, and so forth, in which Chinese loans are facilitated, might this vary by project or by industrial sector because of sectoral structural attributes and their perceived strategic value to the state? Can we graft a strategic value logic to Chinese state behavior that is connected to high-tech and commodity-based sectors versus medium tech and more consumer-oriented sectors that might affect the agency of the national governments and industrial development in Latin America. You know, after all, you do show in the book that as Latin American commodity exports go up, to China goes up, Latin American manufacturing exports goes down. So perhaps there's something there about Chinese strategic value concerns about maximizing, you know, indigenous development that is involved in these Chinese lending projects at the project level and at the industrial sector level. And then finally, you know, and also how about political motivations, right? This is where some of the policy conditionalities may be creeping in, you know, particularly, you know, maybe votes in the United Nations or support for the One China policy. That may, you know, be outside of commercial and neoliberal policy conditionalities, but could, on the Chinese side, be viewed as quite important in terms of state-to-state relations and linking that to lending to Latin American countries. And then in terms of disaggregating Chinese state capital, you know, Ming-Ye has a recent book that condensed that subnationally motivated state capitalism, you know, reflecting the internal political fragmentation in China plays a role in shaping China's global engagement. So it'd be great, you know, to see you engage Ming-Ye's work. And also, there's also existing work by Wendy Lewitt and Mick Ritzmeier about privately owned Chinese multinationals and their Go Global strategy, and how that it varies on the firm level in terms of corporate characteristics and their domestic political status. And so that firm level interaction will become important because, as you argue, commercial conditionalities are quite important in these lending contracts. In terms of moving to kind of national impacts of Chinese loans, and I see I don't have too much time, but one question I had was, are the impacts of these loans always national? Because I find in your case studies, and they're very rich case studies, that we do see sectoral variation, right? I'm going to go back to the sectoral variation, as you point out in both the presentation, but also in the rich case studies that, for example, in the Argentine cases that you brought up, you know, we see variation, you know, on kind of solar, renewable energy versus rail. And in your telling of the story, a lot of it has to do with whether it's market-based channel or state-to-state channel. And I wonder if some of that also reflects sectoral variation, whether it's, you know, because of sectoral attributes or you know, the strategic value of these sectors, you know, I mean, really, frankly, both to the Chinese side, but also to the Latin America side. And so I do think that for the next step, you know, just taking this to the industrial sector can help us really answer even the question that you begin with in the book, which is, will the growing gap with Latin America's resource and commodity sectors and industrial sectors intensify because of the context of Chinese state lending? And then finally, just in terms of the scope conditions of the book, can we extend some of these arguments to other regions of the world and also other types of Chinese global finance, you know, OFDI activity and other equity investments? And I do want to, you know, because right now there's a lot of controversy about the effects of Chinese global capital. So I wonder if, you know, one lesson we could learn from your book is that, you know, it's about market-based procurement and tender, democratic and prudent local governance. These channels are quite important in terms of confronting any of the, you know, more potentially insidious effects of Chinese global capital, whether it's Latin American dependency or, you know, Chinese kind of geostrategic and geopolitical goals. Yeah, I'm going to end here, and thank you again for inviting me. This is an excellent contribution and in demystifying both the agency of Chinese capital and the role of national host institutions. Like Carol, I will definitely be assigning this book to both my undergraduates and my graduate students, and will encourage other scholars to do so as well. Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much, both Carol and Roselyn. Those were terrific discussions. I want to turn it over to Stephen to briefly reply. We've got a bunch of excellent questions that have come into the chat. But if you want to start with just kind of first take responses to the discussants, then I'll start to bring out some of the questions from the chat.
Sure. Yeah. So thank you very much to both Rosie and Carol for some excellent insights, both in terms of, marketing the book, and then also in terms of next steps, research design, where can you go with sort of new projects down the road as well. So I'll try to answer, as quickly as possible, thematically, some of these key questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. I think first, in terms of, highlighting sort of the key element of this book is to look at the financing, right? And to look at sort of what does the financing do from a development standpoint within Latin America, right? So certainly, as Rosie highlights, there's a lot of literature that looks at kind of strategic sectors, right? And, why sort of China might approach one sector versus another. What I'm also trying to kind of highlight is sort of broad trends within the financing, right? That's going to depend upon, for example, local context, whether a government says, we're going to finance this directly through state to state, or we're going to go through public procurement, right? That's often a decision that China confronts, right? And that diversified incremental approach that China has, well, if it goes to a country like Brazil that's emphasizing its PPP and its procurement, it's going to approach the process one way in Brazil versus a different way in an Ecuador or Venezuela, right? That's more open to state-to-state deals, setting up development funds and things along these lines. So now with that in mind, right, then we can ask, well, essentially Rosie's sort of wanting to kind of hear more about the disaggregation story within Latin America, right? And if we think of how does Latin America compare to other regions and how it's different and what China might be doing there versus other regions, don't forget, from an entry perspective, Latin America is an outperformer, right? So this isn't necessarily development aid in the development context going to Latin America, it's commerce, right? And, right, if you look at sort of the two elements, energy and then infrastructure, these are areas where China's had overcapacity domestically, right? So there's a strategic element of investing overseas in these areas of overcapacity, right? So not surprisingly, we see China and Latin America, in sectors where it either has a traditional, right, occupied a traditional space from an energy perspective, like hydroelectric, or it wants to improve its market share, right? Think nuclear in Argentina, right? China's doing that deal in order to expand its space in the nuclear sector, right? So undoubtedly, right, we do see some sectoral variation, but I also think that there's probably more broadly regional variation based upon what China confronts in terms of the local institutional infrastructure, and then what China sort of the opportunities that present themselves from a sectoral standpoint, right? So some other kind of comments then quickly as well. I think one thing to keep in mind too, in terms of the maximizing markets and the strategy internationally, right? I do think that the regulatory forbearance domestically is key for this, right? CDB is supposed to be a commercial entity, right? But it's quasi-commercial, right? It benefits from its AAA rating domestically. It gets cheap financing from Chinese commercial banks. It can maximize markets internationally with this cheap financing. So that model is absolutely key. There also is, and I should be very, very clear here, when I mention learning from Japan, it's on an instrument level, not necessarily on a broad development level, right? So oil for loans initially came from Japan. Similarly, Japan had wanted to use ODA in order to promote commerce, right? OECD wouldn't let Japan do that, right? There were laws against Japan being able to do that once Japan had joined. China purposely, right, kind of circumvents those institutions so it has more flexibility. So it's really importing more, I think, some of the instruments from its historical experiences with Japan rather than an overall model. Clearly, the China model is distinct, even in terms of the way it amasses capital, right? It being kind of more state-led and administrative compared to Japan then as well. In terms of some of the other questions too, very quickly, that Carol had highlighted, what about sort of on an infrastructure level, the quality of these investments, right? Because certainly we have a big development push, right? And the lure of Chinese financing is that countries with low savings can use this capacity in order to have a development push, right? So that was very enticing to a place like Ecuador. But then there's a question of once you invest in infrastructure, what's the quality? And so I think what Carol was highlighting in Venezuela, and also what we see in Ecuador, is some concerns post-project about the quality of those investments, right? The fissures in the construction and so forth. So certainly I think that's an important element to keep in mind here as well. There's also sort of, I think very important to highlight too, is this question of, sort of is China monolithic or not as well, right? Which I think sort of ran across Rosie's questions from earlier. And there, I think, you have the CDB and the Exim Bank of China, right? In the book, based upon the instruments, right? Sometimes what Exim Bank is doing is different from China Development Bank. That maximizing market strategy is a very strong sort of strategy that CDB tends to use. 90% of its investments, right? 90% of Latin American investments are from CDB, right? So this story is very much a CDB-centric story. That being said, China Exim Bank also uses a variety of tools. We see some of the trade financing tools in Latin America, but even in sectors like nuclear, you see Exim Bank playing a similar role to CDB as a catalyst, right? Providing cheap financing to maximize markets and increase China's strategic space abroad. So those are some quick comments. We can always discuss these further as well. But thank you very much for kind of your careful reading of the book and your suggestions moving forward about sort of different things I could do from a research design perspective. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. So there are some terrific questions in the chat. I'm sure we won't get to all of them, although some the discussants have already pulled out pieces of. One that I think only came up very quickly in a comment Carol made about corruption, kind of commenting that I believe in Argentina, you were saying they were frustrated by the lack of flexibility, which basically meant perhaps the corruption side. So one of the questions is there evidence of an increase in corruption in the processes where you're seeing a lot of this loan activity? And I think kind of editorializing on top of that, just if you've got a lot of either the multilateral banks who have rules against it, or some countries like the United States that have foreign overseas practice rules and things like that. If China doesn't have those rules, is that another way in which this is differing, or do they have their own rules kind of constraining large-scale corruption on the receiving side?
Thank you very much. And that actually kind of highlights part of the question too that I wanted to follow up with Carol. So that's fantastic. So I'll answer it in twofold. One, in terms of corruption, this isn't a study of corruption per se. So, I don't have a barometer for corruption, or I don't look at sort of the variation of corruption in the region, but I have done a lot of field research interviews in the region. And what I hear a lot about is complaints in terms of the fine print, complaints in terms of the lack of transparency. And so I think that sort of scope condition where you have contracts that aren't transparent creates a situation that can be ripe for corruption. Simultaneously, thinking about, right, Carol was asking, well, where is the discretion in some of these deals? Sometimes it's very obvious. It's through a state-to-state development deal, right? In the case of Venezuela, you get tons of discretion through that. Other times, right, you have two parts of the deal. There's a Chinese machinery part of the deal, right? Chinese content part of the deal, usually 100% of that financed by China. There's accounts in China, and it's paid directly to those Chinese companies. The other part, the fungibility, comes from the civil works projects locally, right? So a place like Argentina's doing a lot of those local civil works projects. They may complain about, wanting to have even more latitude, but they also get latitude in the way they sort of implement those projects and the financing of the projects. There's also then some uncertainty even in terms of the way local governments implement the projects as well, given that, right, there is that fungibility there too. So I think those are very key features to highlight. And I think alongside of that, one last point is the investment channel is really key from that standpoint, right? Because if it's through state to state, That's where the lack of transparency is, right? Even as revealed by sort of lawyers like Anna Gelpern, that's recently looked at this through the Center of Global Development. There's a lot of secrecy and confidentiality clauses within these agreements. I heard a lot about that in the field too, right? Where the officials were limited in terms of what they could talk about and under what contexts. Some chose to talk about it anyways, others did not. But they did highlight these confidentiality clauses. So I think when there's these state-to-state deals in particular, there's a lot of concerns about sort of the underlying conditions in the fine print. And comparatively, when it runs through the market channel, things tend to be more transparent in public.
So one other question from Barbara Stallings was, in some sense, how is the arrangement working from the policy bank side, right? Like in some ways, so what are they getting out of this? If they're doing all this stuff where they're making kind of conditional loans or riskier loans in the service of kind of broader economic strategy and commercialization interests, are they getting compensated directly some way? Is it just that they're doing what they're told and kind of assuming that's where they're financing, why their financing is cheaper? And just mechanically, how can you get banks to make these choices?
Right. So I think that part of the design here is kind of a catalytic finance design, right? That, even on sort of when you look at the clientele from the policy banks, what they're trying to do, and interviewing people from the clientele side too, right? Sometimes these investments are immediately successful and sometimes they're not. There's the attitude that over the long run, right, once you kind of invest in this infrastructure, there's going to be multiplier effects in terms of more infrastructure down the road, more trade, more investment with a long-term horizon. If sort of certain companies get a loss today, the hope is that they'll get new projects, right, or rewarded new contracts in the long run, right? And so part of it involves that long-term philosophy. I also think part of it involves, sort of allowing, right, through those loans to have commercial success. And then once you start having commercial successes, the idea is then increasingly you'd be able to get paid back as well, even under situations when perhaps the projects aren't immediately successful. How is CDB willing to do this? I would make the argument, right, that if counterfactually you didn't have as much regulatory forbearance, if counterfactually they didn't have access to this cheap financing, they'd have to be a lot stingier about what they do abroad. I think to a large extent, right, that's given them far more flexibility, right? And so I think that, they're able to kind of absorb some of these inefficiencies or problems in an early state of project that not necessarily, a Western bank would be able to do in the same way under a lot of pressure of its shareholders more immediately. So I do think that sort of the model itself gives CDB more flexibility. And from that standpoint, you can even think of the multilateral restructuring that's happening globally, right? Where China is a part of the DSSI, right? Is part of this process of debt restructuring internationally, but the CDB falls outside of that, right? The CDB is able to restructure bilaterally, so they have not only this regulatory forbearance domestically, they have the flexibility in how they restructure as well, right? So I think compared to a traditional bank, there's far more flexibility in the operational structure for it to be able to absorb some early losses compared to other banks.
I want to pick up on that last point because that was something that showed up in a couple of questions also, and I'd invite Carol and Roselyn to join in if they have thoughts here too. It's just kind of this unique role China's having where, so if they're not in the Paris Club. So one question was kind of like, how is enforcement working if you're not part of the group that is kind of all together saying, here's how it's going to work when things go bad? And then similarly, in events with people talking about, what's happening to the global economy post-crisis, there is a sense that there is going to have to be a lot of restructuring, in some cases, kind of writing off a bunch of debt in various countries that have gotten hit hard. And how is China going to fit into that?
So I think that we see China essentially taking a dual strategy, right? Where on one level, we see it flagging the importance of multilateralism. We see through the BRI framework, it even sort of promoting debt restructuring frameworks that are similar to the IMF. We also see sort of China as a major stakeholder in organizations like the IMF, sort of willingly, right, letting the IMF come in and renegotiate with countries as well and extend new loans. So there's a multilateral element of what they're doing. But then in some ways they're trying to get the best of both worlds, right? Where they enter multilateral agreements, but then they're keeping as much bilateral discretion as possible. Latin America, we see this very clearly because CDB is the main creditor. So as a result, it's doing a lot of this independent bilateral restructuring. And in part that's motivated by, as I mentioned, investments going awry in places like Venezuela, but even kind of a public perception standpoint, right? I think one of Rosie's questions was, okay, well, how does public perceptions play in here? Place like Ecuador, right? Arguably, right, when you had years of oil shipments, future oil shipments that were already reserved for China, there were a lot of questions about sort of the utility of Chinese investments within Ecuador, right? So as a result, you even see China willingly restructuring a place like Ecuador, not only for financial reasons, but also geopolitical reasons, right? Where you already had a case of Venezuela that gets these headlines of debt trap. China doesn't want more of those, whether that's correct or not, right? And so I do think that they're trying to basically have a multilateral effort, be considered to be a good stakeholder internationally while reserving bilateral discretion at the same time.
Great. Carol or Roselyn, do you have anything you want to add to that, or?
Well, I'm just looking in the chat, and there's these interesting questions from people whose work I love. William Norris, Ming Yi, and Barbara Stallings are all asking about the COVID question and the post-COVID. And if Stephen could extrapolate from his wonderful database, because obviously it's got to go in a different direction, given the depth of, I think, what we're looking at in terms of recession, depression, lasting in Latin America. Like, where is this going?
Sure.
Actually, just before you do, I wanted to toss that. I was saving that for the last question. I wanted to toss that to all three of you, just because it is a question, as Carol noted, it's showing up a lot, is kind of extrapolating from the book. Where is this going now, right? If you've got countries with different borrowing capacities going forward, if you've got different, there was a question about sectorally, where might China pivot? If there are going to be different sectoral choices, different just quantity choices, different workout choices, and for that matter, just where you think the opportunities they see as most attractive, where they might go. So I'd love to hear, Stephen, your thoughts on that, but I'd encourage Carol and Roselyn to jump in as well after.
So yes, my first response will reflect sort of the mechanisms in the book. The second response will reflect kind of extrapolation to some extent, given COVID. So the first response, I think these instruments, these channels, state versus market, part of what's happened since the commodity downturn is a learning story for China, right? Where it's increasingly, given sort of debt problems ranging from Ecuador to Venezuela to Argentina and even Bolivia, it's realizing these big, massive investments on state-to-state level, they still can happen, but they need to be more diversified, right? So now we're seeing more of this equity, state-backed equity fund investments, as mentioned earlier. I would expect to see more of that, right? Yeah, there's only been $2 billion over the course of the last few years, but it tends to be in market-oriented economies, right? Places, that have been sort of a bit more stable and friendly from a market standpoint. So in some ways, we see China pivoting more towards market tools, right? I think that's one, given the debt burden from COVID, that's one expectation I have, right? With these two mechanisms, China will be doing more and more on a market basis. We even see it in terms of commercial banks, right? Even though commercial bank activity is limited, it's been capped at 100 million historically in these deals. We're seeing the local presence in terms of counterparty banks, et cetera, expand in a lot of these countries. And that actually then plugs into what the future holds, the second part of the question, the extrapolation. I think to a large extent, what we've seen historically is China's emphasis in Latin America has been physical infrastructure. If you look at sort of their documents, in terms of China-Latin America relations looking forward over the course of the next several years, there's a lot more overtures now in terms of the digital economy, right? So we see telecom and we see financial services, health, all of these kind of other sectors, even if the investment is slow to kind of come to fruition, we're seeing more of an emphasis on those sectors. And not surprisingly, also overlap with kind of more smaller incremental investments and more towards the market, right? And so we're even seeing that in terms of in middle of COVID, there was overtures in terms of health cooperation. We've seen $1 billion dedicated to vaccine research in the region. We see very strong allocations of vaccines from China and places like Brazil. So there's undoubtedly an entire vaccine mass diplomacy that is not only oriented towards aid and development, but once again, the theme from before, commerce, right? Even branding in sectors like healthcare and the digital economy over the long run. Over to Rosie, as well as Carol.
No, great. I mean, that Stephen essentially took what I wanted to say. I guess one comment I was going to say was that, we saw particularly last April and on, there were these kind of alarms going around the world in terms of hostile takeovers, right? Or at least the fear of hostile takeovers by Chinese companies and OFDI, during the pandemic, when countries are focused on kind of surges and with slowed industrial development, but Chinese companies kind of coming in. And so I do agree with Stephen that China will respond to some of these market opportunities, right? Market opportunities that are legitimately, or at least viewed as legitimately market opportunities, even if perceived by the countries themselves as hostile. And in terms of the sectoral kind of makeup of China responding to these opportunities, I think, what was outlined in the, Made in China 2024, and just, some of these kind of more strategic sectors, digital, health, green energy, I think all of it will be important to China. And really taking advantage of all the tools are in the toolbox, state and market.
Also, sorry, Cynthia McClintock mentioned something important with regard to China and COVID, and that is the corruption that has quickly come to the fore. We're always going to have corruption. The thing about COVID corruption with regard to China is that it really is a matter of life or death. And, just from the news the last couple of days, it's just dire. It's just horrible. So let me just say that yes, services, diversification of funding into these countries, but right now we really only see it in Brazil. The Chileans have held out to get higher value-added investment in lending from China projects. The Mexicans have been holding out. God knows what they're doing now, but they were holding out for something better than just oil deals. Something industrial, and it took the U.S.-China trade war for them to cash in on some of that, exporting intermediate goods to China. But it's been narrow, okay? And so China, all right, from the Chinese perspective, these two important policy banks, especially CDB, sorry. What's the landscape? Where are they going to go? And they aren't going very many other places, quite frankly, than Brazil. Argentina is obviously a debt crisis for China. It's got them in a bit of a creditor trap. So, I mean, yes, it is going to go in this direction, but you make a really interesting point, Stephen, in one of the sort of off-the-cuff things in the book, which is that, they're diversifying. The Chinese are diversifying in Brazil just to get the Brazilians to stop complaining about premature deindustrialization and reprimarization of the economy driven by China. So, I mean, how authentic are these industrial investments going to be? I think Brazil's really it.
So I wanted to turn it to Stephen last. We're just about at, or actually we're a bit over time. So Stephen, I wanted to let you kind of wrap things up, and you can respond to kind of the final thoughts, but just also wrap things up.
Sure. So it's been a really excellent discussion, a lively, fun discussion, and I really enjoyed it. I want to make two final points that I think are relevant to the questions moving forward as well, in terms of how China, what's their strategy moving forward. I think one thing that I didn't highlight before that's also really key is renminbi internationalization, right? As you get the local bank presence, part of that local bank presence is also over the long run through transactions to promote the renminbi. Now, a lot of the commodity-based transactions we're seeing in Latin America historically are dollar-based, but nonetheless, China, again, that long-term strategy is getting sort of the facilities in the region in order to, both on a commercial bank level and a central bank level through swaps, have sort of the renminbi circulating, right? So I think that's very key. The second point too, particularly that relates to corruption and rent seeking, is I think that one important lesson here is that China domestically, had a lot of success with its growth strategy and investment strategy, but had a huge amount of savings to marshal, right? comparatively, a lot of the places it's investing, even though they're emerging market countries, they don't have that same level of savings. So if there's rent seeking, if there's corruptions, if there's inefficiency, there's less room to maneuver and absorb those costs. And that's what I think has put China in this defensive lending position in many countries, right? Where domestically it had massive savings, it didn't have to worry in that same way, but internationally it has to think, well, do I want to keep committing savings or new loans? Maybe not, but they're forced anyways with the level of debt they have already to be in a restructuring defensive position. So thank you very much. This was a wonderful discussion. I could go on in the discussion for another 3 hours. It was so much fun. But thanks to our discussants, and thanks to Jay as well for moderating, and thanks to IIEP.
Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you again to our discussants. Thanks to everyone for some excellent questions. And I guess go get the book and take a look at it. So thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.